I gotta run to keep from hiding, and I'm bound to keep on riding. I got one more silver dollar, but I'm not gonna let them catch me, no. Not gonna let them catch the midnight rider.
Welcome you to this fabulous Westport Library, which deserves its own applause. We're all blessed to have a facility like this in the town of Westport. It's a great and wonderful asset of what makes Westport, Westport. The subject of today's show, called Journey to the 5 M's, is a rather unusual topic and not known to many people. In fact, we claim to have invented the idea, but we really didn't. We really stole it from Nashville when I was down there in the RCA studio building that was about to be bulldozed when the recording studios were being taken out and analog was being replaced by digital. So many of the top recording studios were threatened with extinction, including the RCA #1, where Patsy Cline and Chet Atkins and everyone else in country music had always lived in RCA, but it was saved because a blues-loving attorney named Aubrey Preston stepped up and put a couple of $1 million down and saved the extinction of the recording studio by donating. He is a blues aficionado and an attorney. And I went to his office with Steve Cropper, who I was working with down there. And in his office was his map of the Deep South with towns drawn in between with a sign on top of it that said, to the 5 M's, Macon, Memphis, Motown, Shoals, etc. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting idea. I'd like to do that. I'd like to take that journey. So today we're going to take that journey. It's going to be a road trip through the Deep South, where we perceive and believe the blues music, the rhythm and blues music, the soul music, later the rap music, all came from, mostly. And so we are honored and privileged today to have a scholar and author, Mr. Brian Torff, who's coming out in a moment to speak about his journey himself to the Deep South. And he did it not once or twice, but several times. And so Brian is going to come out and speak a bit in just a few moments. But before he does, the one observation, or I had several observations in doing this project about the 5 M's and how it ended up that these 5 towns had so much of the contribution to American rhythm and blues music. And it's very clear that in each and every instance, there's always a key figure or a visionary or a fortune teller who understood the market for the music ahead of making the recording studio, whether it be Berry Gordy or Rick Hall or Henry Stone or Jerry Wexler. Someone had to have the idea and the foresight and the energy and the drive and the enthusiasm to make these recording histories, create them in Memphis, in Macon, in Miami, etc. So we will be traveling to these 5 cities and showing you examples of the music from all 5. But first, I would like to introduce you to our speaker, who's going to explain his travels and what he found along the way, and you'll see evidence behind him on the media board. Brian Torff is a Guilford, Connecticut native now, born in Chicago. He's a renowned musician, composer, and author of the book called Seize the Beat, which I recommend highly. It's the most interesting music history book I've ever seen. He's currently professor of music and music program director at Fairfield University. In 1992, he served as co-chairperson of the Music Advisory Board for the National Endowment for the Arts. and in 2008 was honored as Artist of the Year by the Fairfield Arts Council. Brian's professional career began in 1974 when bassist Milt Hinton offered him the opportunity to tour with Cleo Lane. And during the 70s, Brian recorded and performed with pianists Mary Lou Williams and Marion McPartlin, and toured with jazz violin virtuoso Stephen Grappelli. He played in pianist Errol Garner's last group with Dizzy Gillespie, and worked in the Oliver Nelson Big Band and the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra. In '79, Brian Torff joined pianist George Shearing. During their 3-year lengthy collaboration, they toured worldwide and were featured on The Tonight Show with Merv Griffin, hosted their own PBS special, and their third album won a Grammy for the vocalist Mel Torme. Torff now performs his own music as a songwriter, guitarist, and vocalist in his own band that includes sax and drums. And Brian's group sounds is inspired by the Harvard On the Road to Civil Rights tour, the one he took to some places that he felt were so gripping they rendered him speechless. The trip changed his life and his music, he claims, and he says he now draws on these influences, for they have become friends and sources of inspiration. His Southern research, photos, and artifacts have been exhibited, and his books on American music, Seize the Beat, are used in universities all over the country. Will you please welcome Brian Torff?
Be my woman, gala, be your man. Be my woman, gala, be your man. Be my woman, gala, be your man. Every Sunday dollar in your hand. In your hand, Rosie, in your hand. Every Sunday dollar in your hand. I gotta run, keep from hiding, and I'm bound to keep on riding. I got one more silver dollar, but I'm not gonna let them catch me, no. Not gonna let them catch the midnight rider. I gotta run, keep from hiding. Bound to keep on riding, but I got one more silver dollar, and I'm not gonna let them catch me now. Not gonna let them catch a midnight rider. Thank you and welcome. Now, what does an over 100-year-old Southern work song that I played first have to do with an Allman Brothers song from 1970s? American music comes from the land, and those diverse regions offer a variety of voices that contain multitudes. Welcome to our event this afternoon, which will present a sampling of America's classic music. Music is an art form that brings the past forward. I would like to share with you some images from my Southern research tours. This will hopefully bring the music that you're going to hear this afternoon and the people into sharper focus. So let's take a look. This is some Mississippi cotton fields. The music, as I say, comes from the land, and it comes from people singing in the fields, and eventually what's going to happen is that music is going to evolve, just like the two songs that I did for you this afternoon do. It comes from the land, it comes from the workers, it comes from people singing, call and response in the fields. And there's something very gripping about walking through a Mississippi cotton field because you can really feel the ancestors when you're there. I don't know if you can read this, but on this post, it says, "Blues, born here, raised everywhere." I like to think of the blues as the Mississippi River. It's this huge force of water, and then there are all these tributaries. And so that, to me, is a musical analogy that says the same thing. This music that you're going to hear this afternoon comes out of the blues. It may not always sound exactly like the blues, but it comes from the feeling and the voices of that region of the United States. This is a jute joint. What's left of it in Helena, Arkansas. What is a jute joint? For people who don't know, it was basically then either a privately owned shack that was turned into a nightclub, or it was a restaurant come music venue. And a lot of them, as you can see here, are kind of in disrepair. They're boarded up. Some of them look like they're about to fall down. There are not too many working jute joints anymore, but this was basically the musical laboratory that what the great blues singers worked in, and it was a very rich environment of people who worked by day and sang blues by night. Just outside of Cleveland, Mississippi, you drive about 5 miles out and you come to Dockery Farms. Dockery Farms is one of the most famous sites of the blues because this is exactly where great musicians like Charlie Patton and Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, all worked in the farm during the day, and then they would go out to their local gigs at night and tear it up and then come back the next morning and work again. So it was very much kind of again, of the land, and it's really great that the Stovall Plantation and Dockery Farms is still there because it's a real landmark for our music. How many people know the name Robert Johnson? Raise your hand. Most of us. Good for you. All right. We don't know much about Robert Johnson. He's kind of a myth and a phantom because he died poisoned in a jute joint. And this was largely before he even became popular at all. We don't know much about him, but I had the honor of standing at his gravesite. There's some phony ones, but this is actually the real one where witnesses have testified, yes, he's really buried there. What was so great about Robert Johnson was the fact that he was a visionary. He kind of envisioned rock and roll before it even was an idea, and he was already playing those rhythms on the guitar. Plus, if you look at a Robert Johnson song line by line, it is so deep in its poetic value that Bob Dylan, when he was coming up, used to copy the lyrics of Robert Johnson just to see how did he put it together, how did he put this idea with this, with that. And Robert Johnson's music was dark, and so a lot of times, he died in 1938, a lot of pop music in America is usually not dark because people don't really want to hear that and it doesn't sell very well. But his vision of America was different. It was, as Grail Marcus, the writer, said, it was a vision of a land without salvation, but the greater satisfaction of life comes out of struggle. And so there's, to me, an inner strength to this music that basically says, you know, no matter how bad things are, there is an ashe, an inner life force that always is there if you can call upon it. Now we're going to get a little more modern. This is the one-room shack that Elvis Presley grew up in. It is in Tupelo, Mississippi. It is no bigger, it's actually probably smaller than from this stage to that bookcase right there. It was built by his father, and it is basically what they call a shotgun shack, because you could shoot a gun through the front door and it come out the back. And as you walk in, there is a very small bedroom. I mean, you can barely walk through it. There's a bed and a fireplace, and I guess that's where young Elvis slept with his parents. And then you walk into the next room, and there's a kitchen with an ice box, a couple of chairs, a wooden table, and that's it. And so it's a real reminder of how the deep poverty that so many people, white and black, lived in and still live in the South to this day. And of course, well, you're going to hear more about Elvis in this program, but certainly he'd be the first one to tell you that without gospel music and the blues and so many of the Southern country styles he heard, he would have never existed. I don't think he said it enough, but I think that Elvis is an example then of what it took to bring this music mainstream in a very prejudiced, separate America at that time. This statue I found very interesting. It's on the grounds of the Elvis Museum, and you see two images here. One, you see a young boy with a guitar, kind of in overalls, and you can kind of feel the poverty, right? But not necessarily despair of that area. Then you see the superstar God, right, like this. And I think that transition is really an example of something that probably nobody could have negotiated, and certainly Elvis could not, and it led to his demise. But to make that sort of transition from being a Mississippi country boy to suddenly being the most popular person in the world was really always too much. When you travel down Highway 61 is one of the most famous roads in the South. You come to a blues center, and what has always struck me in my travels down there is they celebrate the blues, and I know that tourists want to see something about the blues there, but there's so few venues. There are very few music venues in the South where you can hear this music anymore, and I think that's kind of the shame, is the memory is there and the music is still in the air, but there's not enough support, and the economy is not very good, and so as a result, you don't really get the full force that you would have got many years ago. That brings us to Memphis. Now, for people who know about the Great Migration, it really started around 1919, and it was largely blacks, some poor whites, moving out of the South, out of despair of poverty, prejudice, Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan. There are many, many reasons to leave the South. And the first stop for most people was Memphis, and of course many stayed there because the city offered opportunity, radio stations, record companies, live venues, and then many went up to Kansas City. Many ended up in where I'm from, Chicago, and so Chicago, growing up there in the 60s when I did, was very southern, and that's why they call Chicago the Up South, because you had so many people from the Mississippi Delta living in that town and carrying on more electrified sound of the blues, but still that very much that influence was there. So in Memphis, we come to the Stax, what's now a museum. The original recording session studio was really, they went bankrupt by the middle 1970s, and the building just kind of lay in ruin. And this is another thing that is kind of a shame about a number of aspects of Memphis, is that there are facsimiles of what was there. The real things are not there. But in this museum, they did rebuild it as close as they could to what it was. It was a movie theater, and it was a movie theater that was taken over by two enterprising people, Jim Stewart, who was a country musician who really thought he was going to study to record country music, and his sister, Estelle Axton. But they were in a black area of Memphis, and so they had no idea about blues or soul music, but people kept wandering in from the neighborhood, wondering what was going on, and asking for an audition. And so, as Estelle Axton once so beautifully said, we didn't see race, we saw talent. And Stax was one of the great soul labels. You're going to hear a lot of that, already have, but you're going to hear a lot of that music in today's program. It was all built on rhythm. And this is Al Jackson's drum. Al Jackson was the drummer for Booker T and the MGs. And this is one of the things that's fascinating to me about music, and why I love to talk about it and teach it, is if music comes from the land, each land is different. So the way they play in Chicago is not the same way they play in Detroit or in Memphis or in Muscle Shoals or in Miami. Each, I don't know if it's the water or what is, but there's some kind of chemistry that exists in every geographic area that makes it unique and gives it a unique sound. And today's concert will be an example of that sort of diversity in music. To me, this photo says it all. Stax was way ahead of the time, not just musically, but socially. You see in this picture members of the ensemble who are black and white, and they are collaborating. Memphis was one of the most prejudiced, violent towns in America, and so these individuals that I'm showing you here couldn't walk down the street and get a cup of coffee. They couldn't walk down to a diner and have a meal together because there'd be a lot of trouble. So inside this recording studio, it was like a sanctuary of people who really loved each other and made great music together. And so I think from a social aspect, one of the things about the music you hear today is that it was really progressive. Without really trying to be, without trying to make a big deal about it, it was the fact that there was a movement of diverse people working together, and to me, it says a lot. And obviously there would be a lot of change in the years to come. A few blocks, I guess maybe half a mile away or so, you get to Sun Studios. Sun Studios, of course, was the famous studio of Elvis, and it was basically built by Sam Phillips, who was from Alabama. I'll show you a picture of him later on. And he loved black music, and he worked in the fields in Alabama with black co-workers who would sing and would play a little guitar. And he realized, Sam Phillips, when he got to Memphis, there were no recording studios in the South that admitted blacks. None. And so his idea was, I'm going to start the studio, and I'm going to bring in the best black and white talent, and I'm going to record them. And so I think that's the thing about this vision, is that the people who, we talk about the musicians and they're important, of course they're essential, but the fact is there were people behind the scenes who really had, I guess sometimes people say the example of a genius is someone who can see a market before it exists. Sam Phillips saw that. He struggled because black records were not selling. It's hard to get them on the radio, forget about television. And that's when he made his classic statement, which is still one of the most quoted statements in rock and roll history. If I could find a white man who could sing like a black man, I could make $1 million. And of course, that's when Elvis walked in. This is the studio. It's very small, very modest. It hasn't changed a bit. They even still have the microphones that Roy Orbison and Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis used. And it's still a working studio. I think they do tours by day, and they do recording sessions at night. The thing about these studios that I found when you visit is, yes, it's microphones and cables and drum sets and things like that, but I think each one, maybe I'm being a romantic now, has a certain sort of vibe or feeling to it. And I think that's really what makes them different from recording it in your bedroom with your MacBook Pro. Not that that's bad, okay? But there's something about the chemistry of people working together that really made those records great. And this was an environment that allowed that to happen. I was walking down the street outside of Sun Studios, and I came upon a kind of a flea market or a bazaar, and here were these beautiful African dresses, and it reminded me, we're basically talking about a subject that draws from Africa, Africa in America, okay? And so what a lot of my students at Fairfield U don't realize is how African this country really is, and how much we draw on these roots and how essential it is to our culture. And you really feel that in the South. Okay, so we traveled down to Muscle Shoals. Muscle Shoals is a pretty small town, but it's a very famous town. It's a famous town because of a couple recording studios that made some of the greatest recordings in American music, and many, many other people followed after that. This is Fame Studio in Muscle Shoals. Fame Studio was started by a man named Rick Hall. Rick Hall was a fledgling songwriter, and he wanted to put a studio together, and he wanted to make hit records. And so the thing that was unique, again, about Fame Studio was it was largely white Southern boys, they called themselves the Swampers, doing sessions with whoever would come down there. And so people would get off the plane like Aretha Franklin and Wilson Pickett and walk into the studio and be astonished to see the band because it didn't look like what they thought it was going to look like, because they were making all these very funky, very earthy, country-sounding records and had no idea that these musicians were all white. So I think that's, again, one of the wonderful things about this story is there are many surprises here, and Aretha, of course, changed her career in the studio. She sat at that piano in the back there. It's a different piano now, so I got to admit, that's not the original piano, but she basically then, how many of you have seen the Muscle Shoals documentary? Anybody here? It's a must. It's a fantastic documentary. And she pretty much directed it, and I think this is important for a number of reasons. One, women generally had no independence or a leadership in the music business at this particular time. They were always run by a male producer. They were always told what to sing, how to dress, what to do, what not to do. And Atlantic, who had gotten her contract from Columbia, was very smart in saying, she's completely got it together. Let her run her own studio or session and her own career. And of course, it led to some of the great hits that you all know. So it's a powerful place of female empowerment to me. This is Rick Hall's office upstairs. Guys, I don't recommend you taking these ideas for your man cave. They're a little dated, but this is basically, he worked tirelessly. This is a very difficult business, I have to point out, because the major labels, Columbia, Capitol, Decca, they didn't want anything to do with black music or black artists. They basically just saw it as a lot of trouble, and they just didn't want it, okay? So they were basically recording white pop singers, and it was the independent labels like Fame that basically were sticking their neck out, didn't have anywhere the financial resources. A typical way of working would be to make the records, press the records, put them in the back of your car, and then drive thousands of miles cross country, begging or sometimes bribing radio DJs to play these records. And it worked, okay? And one of the main, to me, social liberators here is radio, because radio doesn't segregate, okay? So on a clear night, WLAC in Nashville is so strong a signal that it's going all the way up, way into Canada, and that's where Neil Young and Joni Mitchell are listening to it. And it goes into Hibbing, Minnesota, where Bob Dylan is listening to it. It goes out to Jamaica, where Bob Marley is hearing it. So you have to keep in mind that Southern radio really changed the game, because what happened was the major labels, well, they got fooled. The requests came in from American teenagers, white and black, and asking to play Little Richard or Sam Cooke or whoever it happened to be, and as a result, the whole industry was spinned upside on its head as a result of radio playing what people wanted in that particular area. So to me, it's a great story of how you've got Goliath, the big indie labels, and they've got Sinatra, and they got all that kind of stuff, and that's great, but then you've got the small labels, and they're basically just living hand to mouth. They basically go from one record and pray that somebody buys them, but they won. Across town, the band who played in the studio, the Swampers, decided they weren't really getting along with Rick Hall and they weren't really getting paid very well. And so they started a studio called Shoals Sound. It was tremendously successful because now, by the time the 1970s roll around, artists were all seeing all these records being made in this small southern town. And so Cher came down to Shoals. I mean, just big stars and people you never heard of were all coming to work in these very small studios with the same musicians. That's where it looks on the inside. It's a tour. It used to be a casket factory. And it was it was transformed into a music studio. It's still a working studio by night, and I know there was a reggae band coming in to record that particular evening. I thought it had one of the best environments for recording of anyone I saw. All right, so now we get to, oops. All right, so now we get to Macon, Georgia, and Macon is important for a lot of different reasons. Up at the top on the left there, it basically says where soul lives, and Macon is an example then of another phenomenal small town cultural environment that birthed a lot of music. That's where Otis Redding was from. Otis Redding was on the verge of superstardom. He catapulted really the Stax label up to new heights. He was beginning another almost kind of ascension to superstardom when he died in a plane crash. And that was pretty much the beginning of the end for Stax Records. Now his wife still lives there. There's a small museum. There's a foundation where they do all kinds of things for kids, education, do a lot of wonderful things. The house at the bottom left is where Little Richard was born. And Little Richard was from Macon, and he got his start there playing in local clubs. And what can you say about Little Richard that he hasn't said about himself already? He was the architect of rock and roll, folks, as far as I'm concerned, you know, and what an incredible artist and cultural force in this country. The studio on the bottom right, that's called Capricorn. And Capricorn was a recording studio that was started by a man named Phil Walden. Phil Walden, when he was in college, got the idea to start booking black acts for white fraternity and sororities. Remember, everything was segregated. And one of the acts that he booked was Otis Redding, and Otis became Otis's manager, and they were working together to build this studio, which Otis would never realize. It is important also because of what followed Otis, and that was the Allman Brothers, Marshall Tucker, Charlie Daniels, what people call Southern rock today. Really, a lot of it was recorded in these Capricorn studios. So in Macon, you have the Allman Brothers Museum, and it basically is a former residence where they lived and rehearsed and composed music and got in lots of trouble. But what an innovative band. I'm still in awe of this particular group. On the left are their roadies. They felt that their roadies were so important that they should be on their album cover, live at the Fillmore East. The band on the right, pictured there, is not in New York City on 2nd Avenue. They are in Macon, Georgia. It was just staged that way. What was unique about the Allman Brothers was, first of all, virtuoso players, two incredible lead players, a great bass player, one of the most soulful singers ever in Greg Allman, and two great drummers, one who was black. And that was really taking a chance in the South at that particular time. And so J-Mo, the drummer, has become a friend of mine. We work together occasionally. And it wasn't easy, you know, but the fact was the Allman Brothers would not stand for the typical prejudice that existed in their environment, in their town, and they simply went straight ahead anyway. And of course, their legacy is tremendous. And how many albums, live albums, are better than Live at the Fillmore, really? And JMO said to me, I said, what about that album? He said, man, it was just another night. They're buried in Rosewood Cemetery, the two brothers, and as is Butch Trucks, their drummer, and their bass player, Barry Oakley. And so you can go there and you can visit, which is really interesting because you have the Allman Brothers burial site, and then you come to a place that's mostly Jewish, okay? And then you come to another area that's Civil War veterans. So it's an amazing mixture of people in that interesting place. So we're going to take a look at Motown. I'm due to go to Detroit next year to research this further, but Detroit was, again, another stop on the Underground Railroad. And it was a place of tremendous talent in the 50s and 60s. The arts were very supported in the schools, and you heard great singers and great musicians in Detroit churches every Sunday. And there was a moderately successful songwriter by the name of Berry Gordy. And Berry Gordy started a record store in a black area of Detroit, selling mainly jazz and blues and typical black music. And it failed. And he couldn't understand why it would fail. Why wouldn't black people in the black area of Detroit buy these records? And then he had that vision, right? That vision I talked about earlier on. He said, look, right now, either the way it's marketed is either whites buy this kind of music and blacks buy this kind of music. And so he said, why can't we come up with something where young black and white teenagers will love both, will love the same music at the same time? And so his vision for Motown was based on that ideal, plus working in the Detroit assembly line. You know, when you work on an assembly line is, I guess, I've never worked on one myself. I'm acting like I know what I'm talking about. You know, there's one guy puts on the hubcaps, and somebody else puts on the carburetor. And don't ever ask me to fix your car, ladies and gentlemen. But you know what I'm saying. And so he said, I'm going to run the record company that way. And so he used an assembly line approach that said, I'll go find talent. And so I found these three young ladies singing in this church, and I'm going to call you the Supremes. And I saw four guys the other day at an ice cream social. You guys are going to be the Four Tops. And here's another group over here that's playing somewhere outside in the summertime. You guys are going to be the Temptations. And so this is basically how he scouted. And these were teenagers. I mean, you have to keep in mind, these are people with no experience in music whatsoever, really, other than singing in church. And then he would bring them into what is now a museum, but at one small house with an upstairs and downstairs, and basically say, okay, I'll be the producer, and now we're going to find songs for you. In other words, don't tell me what songs you want to sing. We will write songs for you. And so the songwriting team, Holland, Dozier, and Holland, or whoever it was, would tailor-make songs to fit that talent. And then he had great Detroit musicians who were composers, arrangers, jazz musicians, and all of them moonlighting, right? Didn't pay them very well. And he would then bring them in to these recording sessions, and they would record with these high school kids, right? But Gordy was very shrewd because he knew there was no way he was going to sell rough, black Detroit young street talent to white America. And so he didn't put them out on tour. He spent maybe 6 months to a year grooming them. In other words, choreography, certain outfits, how to put on makeup, how to properly wear wigs when you're the Supremes. In other words, a whole finishing school. And so, because he wanted each act to be extremely polished, because he knew it's not going to work. You know, they're just going to end up on the Chitlin circuit like everybody else does. And so, what Gordy really did with Motown was make an incredible breakthrough in American life because his formula worked. Black kids and white kids loved this music. If you played a dance, you had to play a lot of Motown, okay? wasn't really, I love the Beatles, but you can't really dance to the Beatles the way you can dance to Motown. It was funkier. It had a better beat to it. Same with soul records. So really what happened was his vision came true, and sure enough, you start seeing the Supremes headlining in Las Vegas, getting on the Ed Sullivan Show, getting a visibility that most black artists had not had up to that particular time, and you're going to hear a lot more of that kind of music later on today. So this particular picture really, a couple pictures remind me of how important the visionaries are. So at the top left, you have Sam Phillips, and you see in the background Elvis with his trio. And then to the right, that's Rick Hall in front of Fame Studios. The bottom left is Estelle Axton and her brother Jim Stewart. They were the ones who started the Stax label. In the middle is Phil Walden, and Will Walden, of course, was the brains behind Capricorn Records. And then finally, at the right, is Berry Gordy. And so there's a lot of talent in this world, but we don't give enough credit to people who facilitate that talent, who give them an opportunity, who back them, who believe in them, and are willing to be patient to develop that kind of talent. And it's something that we miss today, I have to say. This is a bus stop in Memphis, Tennessee, just around the corner from the Stax record label. Soulsville really kind of, to me, says a lot, not just about Memphis, but about the whole area of the South. And that's one of the reasons why I keep going back there, is because there is a deep sense of roots and tradition, but not leaving it right there, but again, being able to use that as inspiration to bring that past forward. And this quote by Jill Scott, great singer, great rhythm and blues singer, is really true, I think. I've always been a firm believer that soul music never dies. The artists we still listen to today, years after their music was first heard, are mostly soul artists. We still sing along to all of them with our hearts. So in conclusion, there are good reasons why great art never goes out of style. The Southern music represents who we have been and who we are in the present, while shining a light on the future. This music comes from the land, revealing a joyous expression of America at its very best. Why is this all important? Why should we care? Why don't we just listen to the music? It's great. James Baldwin once said, "History is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great forces of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." Thank you, and let's thank Roger Kaufman for this event.